after he did actually surrender to that pressure and agreed to hand over that portfolio to Yigal Allon. So the party, reunite the ranks of the party, and perhaps bring back Ben Gurion. So we said to Eshkol, if you're willing to cede the actual defense portfolio, then it should go into the hands of Moshe Dayan and not into the hands of Levi Eshkol if it's been taken away, and not to Yigal Allon. Because I think that you have to understand that he really had a kind of awe, you know, they'd built the actual armored forces, the tanks as well, but it was as if Moshe Dayan became the hero of that war, and therefore people trusted and relied on Moshe Dayan. If he was omnipotent, and he said there is not going to be a war because the Egyptians do not have an air force that will be able to combat with ours and compete with ours. So all the mobilization of the Syrian and the Egyptian getting ready on the borders and everything that we could see, they're mounting an attack. They said, no, not at all, not at all. They're not. It's just one big drill or an exercise. And when Moshe Dayan said it, they accepted it. Now, what was our position in our party that was made up of the historical Mapai and the other factions that had sort of retired? And there were various controversies here. And they said we shouldn't panic from a big and diverse party, but one should know how to manage an ideological argument, basically, and a democratic decision. So when I said that there should be a secretary general or of the entire secretariat of the party when they should all meet together, then all those members should be there and each should voice their opinion, and there should no longer be a little cabinet kitchen or a kitchen cabinet like we have sort of nowadays. In those days, it would be everyone gathering, everyone voicing their opinion. But the party knew what Sapir thought, what Galili thought, what Golda Meir thought. Each had to come and voice their opinion, and anyone who wanted to deal in historical issues, and they need to read all the minutes of the previous secretariat meetings, and then they would understand that there, in those times, that there were controversies, and my role, amongst others, was that there should be a decision with consensus around it across the board. There were those who wanted the greater, complete Israel, what was called the Shlema, you know, the complete Israel. In other words, I'm not talking about Alterman and Moshe Shamir, and that they would not give up one little inch or fraction of this of Israel. And we're talking about the settling of the Israeli people around the whole of the historical Israel. And we're talking about people who actually followed Tabenkin's views, and we're talking about those parties, and although they didn't actually accept it totally, but if that was an authority and if that was a decision that was taken by everyone, then that was accepted. And there were others, for example, who wanted peace based on the borders from before 1967. We're talking about Pinchas Sapir even. We're talking about people in earnest. Where's Yossi Sarid? Yossi Sarid, here, he's over here as well, under the blanket. No. He was a genius at that time. He was amazing. It's a shame that he's not here in the audience, because I always ask Yossi Sarid, how did Sapir bring Golda? They could have then chosen between Dayan and Allon, like I did after Golda resigned. I did the same. But the center, 500 people in the secretariat, then elected, they had to at the time, between Rabin and Peres. That could have been done after Levi Eshkol actually left. But unfortunately, Tabenkin is passed away in June 71. No, but I'm talking about the entire period. No. But all this tactical drill was carried out actually without the enemy. No. Let me just complete my main point. What I'm trying to say is anyone who was willing to go back to the previous borders, Pinchas Lavon, Ben Aharon, Pinchas Sapir, even David Ben Gurion. He was hesitating about, by the way, the Golan Heights even. Yes, about Jerusalem as well. He vacillated a lot, but I know that he was willing to have a partition of Jerusalem because he didn't want the 100,000 Palestinian Arabs to become citizens of the State of Israel. But what did the party decide? And that was what was agreed on some kind of territorial compromise. That was the equation. That they're not going back to those borders, but that they would mold defendable borders that we would be able to defend. I understand that time is of the essence. No, Sarid gave us our time, gave us his time, so you've got some more time. In other words, when we say defendable borders, in other words, the Yamit area, the Rafiah area would be in the hands of Israel so that you could separate between Egypt and the Gaza Strip, so that you could also create an airport so that the airplanes would be able to turn around, and the Moon Valley near Eilat, that we would be able to also have a little airport there. And of course, history will judge, but they said that they will not give up on the Moon Valley or that Rafiah Yamit area opening. But that also, during the Rabin government, there was always a question, were they ready or not? I don't know if there's any testimony in writing for some kind of land swap as well. So if we're holding on to the opening of Yamit, we're giving Uja el Khafir to the Egyptians, which is nowadays called Nitzana. But it was well known in the Arab world from the Ottoman period. And that, by the way, was a demilitarized area. And then they would have got not El Arish, but something alongside the Gaza Strip, and they would receive Uja El Harish. That was the idea. So here you're talking about some kind of formula that didn't actually. Now, if I remember the precise story, after Nixon was re-elected, and he wanted to launch a whole peace initiative, but he had some kind of political weakness because of Watergate, and so there were discussions at the beginning of March with Golda Meir, and in May '73, Golda Meir said she's going to be 75 years old and she wants to go home. I mean, it was well known during that period. What happened then was that you, in the party, you wielded pressure on Golda Meir, although she wanted to leave, that she should remain. I mean, those are your thoughts. We hear ourselves. Sorry, there's a slight technical problem. They're saying that they can hear themselves when they talk, the speakers. So that Dayan won't actually go back. You created a kind of compromise. In other words, that's when you created Katzrin. That's, in other words, a territory that the Syrians saw as theirs. That's when you created Katzrin, and the same with the Egyptians. And you said, no way. The Galili said that you are not dismantling any of those settlements. What did you expect Sadat to do in a reaction to what you actually did, according to the Galili document? Creating Katzrin, not giving those territories to the Syrians back. Well, ours was a territorial compromise vis-a-vis Egyptians. And with Jordan, there were various sort of contradictions and controversies. And so we didn't accept the Dayan program to keep the back of the mountainside. So the eve of the Yom Kippur War, I mean, that was my kind of historical survey that I've just given you up to now. I said that we did reach a compromise, and it's very interesting to see just before the elections that running up to the elections that should have taken place in October but were postponed to December 73 because of the war, we determined that the defendable borders would ensure for Israel the possibility to efficiently defend themselves against a military attack, and they were based on a territorial compromise. They wouldn't go back to the 67 borders that were a manifestation of aggression, that we would retain the Jewish character of the State of Israel in order to fulfill its ingathering of exiles and ideological needs. And Israel would continue fulfilling this situation as determined on the day of the ceasefire. Now, to your question about Golda's position the eve of the Yom Kippur War, I actually, based on the various discussions that we had, I actually know what was going on. I know that in the literature there's various sort of contradictions. There's who some of the literature blames her, others say no, that she was not to blame, and they acquit her. What was the issue? Sadat wanted that we should promise, even before the negotiations, before we start negotiations, that we should go back to the borders from before the 67 war without any promises on any of the fronts. Suddenly he was worried about the Syrians and the Jordanians. In other words, all the fronts, even before the negotiations. Now, that was something that was totally unacceptable. It was impossible to accept it. It's okay. He said that there won't be a war if you go back to the previous borders. In other words, he's going to promise it to the Americans, but not a complete peace agreement. No. And Golda Meir said that she did not accept that prerequisite, but it is not true to say that she determined that there was a prerequisite. Golda Meir, did not give a prerequisite. She said, let's negotiate. And she sent emissaries. Who was here at the time? The Social Democratic Willy Brandt was here, that I actually welcomed him. And she sent messages through him, and she said, tell Sadat, because he will be surprised by our far-fetching proposals in his favor. Golda Meir was more than okay. She knew how to take decisive decisions. And there was nothing between us. If there were controversies, then she never used to accept. She didn't actually accept my actually opinions. That's true. It's a shame that she isn't here to hear how you complimented her. There was only one thing that she didn't accept, and there I did give in on. She said that Shulamit Aloni should not be on the list over my dead body. And then Shulamit Aloni left, and we lost 3 mandates until the National Religious Party joined. So if there was anything that could have been done to prevent the war through negotiations, I don't think that one could have. One could have perhaps prevented the war, but that's a different issue. And I must admit here as well that there were various things that I did make mistakes vis-à-vis Moshe Dayan, but in May 73, when there was a mobilization of the Arab armies, and they said to us in the Foreign Affairs and Defense Security Committee, they said, no, it's just a drill. I wanted to mobilize the army, the reserves, and it cost a lot of money, and people were saying, oh, what a waste of money. It was totally superfluous. I mean, who told you off? Sapir? No, it wasn't actually Sapir. No, Sapir was okay. He didn't want to be a prime minister because he didn't want to give an order about opening war. and he brought Golda because he couldn't decide between Dayan and Alon. And by the way, Golda had literally left the party on a stretcher, as if at the time. And she was an iron fist at the time. She never lost her senses, like Moshe Dayan did, by the way, during the war. And she gave the command to mobilize additional divisions. There were only 2 actually on Yom Kippur, and she said, no, let's mobilize them. And the fact that she didn't go towards a preemptive strike was also correct. She did rightfully so, and Kissinger will testify to that. And she decided on that herself, despite the American pressure, and that actually the Americans were very happy, and it helped them. And then they sent us the planes that we needed, etc. I think that Shalom Bayit, in other words, that there should be peace in the party, was actually more important than peace, in a way, you're saying. It was for the sake of the citizens, they thought. Is that basically what you're saying? No, not at all. That's not what I said. I'm not trying to say that political sort of peace was more important than real peace. No, all I'm saying is that following the Six-Day War, there was a resolution taken by the United Nations, the Security Council. They said that the war has ended. Now we have to start negotiations so that there should be a peace agreement based on recognized and secure borders. That was the position of the Security Council. But the Arabs said, no, no recognition, no negotiations, and no peace. And it did not change until the 1973 war. What did change is it only changed following the 1973 war. In other words, that Sadat's peace steps was because of the 101 kilometer, because that is when the negotiations started between us and the Egyptians. Because up to that point, Sadat's position in opposition to the Security Council resolution was that there's no peace, no negotiations, and he told us to go back to where we had come from, and other than that, he's not willing to talk about anything else. And in addition to that, stop the immigration to the State of Israel. So Israel, at the time, if you think about what could be accepted, it's very possible that in 1948, had we accepted what they'd offered us, you can start saying in hindsight that there wouldn't have been a 1948 war. But if you look at all this situation, you can start saying, should we have accepted the objection of the Arabs to start negotiations for the actual determination of borders? But no one had no belief or assessment that we're going to actually receive what we wanted. But we said our prerequisite was that we would be willing to compromise, but only through negotiations. Shlomo, I'd like to ask you an audacious question. And I'm going to ask it because you have very openly said that when in December 69, Golda approached you to join it, it was because of your ethnic background. So basically, they did not understand. You know, we were very Ashkenazi at the time, and they didn't understand these issues of the Arab dignity and honor. And I think someone asked Golda if whether after these first achievements, they'd had military achievements. Now, since you're not coming from an inferior position, let us now talk. Don't you think that there was some kind of failure because no one really understood the Arab kind of mental thinking and their whole makeup? That no one came from that kind of background, the Sephardic background. I don't think that all we said is that we need to live here. There was a resolution of the United Nations in 1947 about living here. What are we talking about? The Arab way of thinking, the Jewish way of thinking? I mean, it's not even that. And I think that everything that happened was because of Arab dignity. The decision was taken in November 47, and I've got a copy of the telegram that was sent by the Egyptian foreign minister on the 14th of May 1948, which was a totally open declaration of war to the UN Secretary General. In other words, that they were opposing that decision that there should be a state of Israel. So if we're talking about the Arab dignity and Arab honor, they objected to the inception of the state of Israel, to immigration to Israel. We, of course, weren't talking about that. All we wanted was our little part of paradise here. No. What I'm saying about assuming that Sadat's honor is very important and the Arab honor, maybe wasn't in the back of your mind that he may actually react in a totally different way from what we in Ashkenazi minds, our Western minds, assumed. It was very difficult. That's why we incepted our big army and everything, and we were ready. Do you think it was a mistake? Ultimately, had we been prepared differently, it would have been a mistake on his part. It was a really a big mistake on his part, on Sadat's part. We started in the Yom Kippur War as a failure, but we ended up succeeding. What was worse was that when you start, and what happened with the Arabs was that they started with success and they ended up failing. And that was what was silly, and that was their mistake. All we wanted to do was to sit down and start negotiating with them and reach an agreement vis-à-vis our existence. And I want to stress that the whole issue of the Arab honor and dignity was not an issue of borders. It's something that exists till this very day, and that is vis-à-vis our existence and our recognition, our actual existence here as a state. Last question to both of you, because we're about to conclude. Shlomo, you were a member of the Knesset that wrote that the Agranat authorization, and you dictated to them terms of reference that were such that basically actually moved the people into the limelight who were actually from the executive arm of the army until the days of the containment battles. So the Agranat Commission actually laid all the responsibility on the shoulders of the military people rather than on the statesmen and the politicians, and that actually has created a tremendous sort of rift between these two arms. There were those who thought that at least Golda or Dayan at least ought to resign. What did you feel about all that, about the creation of the commission? I don't remember actually what I thought or not, but I remember that it was decided that they would create the Agranat Commission. I think that instead of looking at what the ties were between the Intel and other peoples, and I'm not quite sure if we really learnt those things properly even till this very day. And I mean, we really didn't deal in those issues. I think that the main problem in the Agranat Commission was that they didn't actually renew anything special. I think that the conclusion vis-à-vis the responsibility of the government or the responsibility of the statesmen was not put under a shadow of doubt. And I think vis-à-vis we were perceived in a state of weakness, because we did make those decisions after all. So if you ask me, I don't think that there should have been a special investigative inquiry to say that the Intel assessments were erroneous. So I don't know if that has actually impacted things in the future till this very day. I'm not quite sure about that. Sorry. Shlomo Hillel's now corrected himself. He kept saying that the relationship between the Intel and the Intel was problematic. What he meant was the Intel and the Mossad. one has to remember that in those days of Golda, even during the Rabin government days, if you talk about a peace agreement, it was only with Jordan. And now you're talking about Egypt and the Golan Heights. But there was always a problem vis-a-vis with other things, but there was always a discussion about a peace agreement with Jordan. Begin was, by the way, in the Six-Day War. He was in the government, and the government was willing to withdraw to the previous borders for Syria and Egypt, but not with Jordan. And he said, vis-a-vis this issue, he's not willing to withdraw to the Jordan because of Judea and Samaria and other areas. But there was never talk about an independent Palestinian state. The territorial compromise was with Jordan. Actually, if sometimes I look back at it, I dream about that, and I sincerely hope that we would reach an agreement with Jordan about an independent Palestinian state, perhaps without the Jordan Valley, with perhaps other areas. But that's what was discussed in those days with Jordan. I think that Arabs were not willing to reach a true peace agreement, and they missed out on that on the 29th of November historical resolution that they could have accepted, and they missed out on it. They didn't accept it in those days. That's the Kaftet November at the United Nations, where there would have been two states. After the war, I think following the war, people did change their minds. And, for example, they were willing to reach an agreement with the Rabin government. And I think that the Rabin government wanted to reach an agreement with Sadat, perhaps giving them the canal and enabled them to rehabilitate so much, to rehabilitate their towns. And we created a motivation for peace in the eyes of Sadat. In other words, all that immense kind of detrimental effect that it would have had on the economy of Egypt. And we helped rehabilitate all that with the peace agreement. We motivated it. But at the time, he actually created that agreement according to what Sadat wanted by withdrawing to the previous borders with Moshe Dayan. I mean, that is somehow a kind of closure with Israeli victory and a peace agreement. And just my last two words. Two last short comments. With Jordan, with King Hussein, even without an agreement, there were very good ties, and they met him covertly as well, and there were understandings. And to our fortune, he remembered the Six-Day War, and in the Yom Kippur War, he decided not to participate in the assault against Israel. In other words, we understood that Arab psychology. It's not possible that we didn't understood, and we knew where they were mistaken and where they were erring. I think when I think about all those people who I wanted to lead the country, Alon in his time, and Dayan, who I wanted as a Minister of Defense, and Yitzhak Rabin, unfortunately, they were all Sabras. They were all Sabras already in those days. So if we talk about Ashkenazi and everything, they were already Sabras.